This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals. Because of the program's theme and controversial subject matter, parental discretion should be exercised.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
You are a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army.
Correct.
Now, and how does the Army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people that have so much to gain and have such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
I don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
are these people in very high positions yet?
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 3. I'm your co-host Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, in a spirit of maybe staying a little bit topical as smoke and flames engulf in every region of the San Francisco Bay Area that I grew up in, I thought it might be apropos to talk about one of the more mysterious and strange figures that came out of San Francisco, which won't touch overtly too much on our little dive into the world of Kamala last week, but we'll dive into an even deeper world of military psyops, Satanism, child abuse, neo-Nazism, esoteric Hitlerism, and so on. And so
the warning at the beginning of the show has never been more apposite. This is just a content warning for the podcast to follow, that there might be some sensitive subjects discussed, involving satanic ritual abuse and such things. So if anything like that, is a trigger, then be advised.
Yes, and I would try to put it in the show notes, the sections in which we talk about particularly things surrounding the so-called satanic panic abuse scandals of the 1980s, and I will probably provide a timestamp in case you want to skip through some of that, but we are actually going to be talking about the 1988 Geraldo special that we copped the intro to our show from. And as Khalid said, it has never been more apropos to the episode we are doing today, which is going to be a deep exploration of Lieutenant Colonel Ipsissimus Dr. Michael Angelo Aquino Jr., Baron of Racine, Clan Campbell.
Yes. Well, you forgot 6th degree, the Ipsissimus 6th degree.
You're right. I believe the only person to ever attain that rank in the Temple of Set, which we've talked about before. So if you've listened to the first 2 episodes, you know a little bit about Michael Aquino. We've talked about his theory when he was a military PSYOP officer of MindWarrior, which we suspect was at least somewhat influential in the sort of strategic the evolution of strategic thinking in the U.S. military and maybe even the wider government from the 1980s onward. But we wanted to do a real comprehensive breakdown of this very strange figure who, if you've ever researched conspiracy theories before, he is somebody that you will stumble upon sooner or later. He not only is his official resume full of very suspicious items, but he's been linked to any number of conspiracy theories. I think in some cases quite justifiably, and maybe in other cases a little bit less so, but we're going to try to sort through all the disinfo, of which he was such an expert at disseminating, and try to get to the core of who this person was and what kind of influence they had and what kind of perhaps ideological tendencies, and also...
It also maybe bears mentioning that he's an important figure in our own friendship. Because early on.
Do you want to talk about, before we jump in? I think it may be a personal narrative. It could be appropriate. I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is like kind of the genesis of this whole podcast and like our whole adventure into the dark occult together, going all the way back to when did all this happen? I feel like it must have been in 2014.
Yes.
When you were kind of first getting into some of this stuff. Or start getting into it really seriously. It was kind of after you had gone down the rabbit hole of, who was it, like Brock Pierce and all that stuff, and
Mark Collins Rector and Chad Shackley and the Den Network, which we will definitely do an episode on later. That was sort of an initiatory conspiracy dive for myself that kind of radicalized me and disturbed me to my core, and it had specifically to do with Brock Pierce's involvement in the Bitcoin Foundation and various cryptocurrency outfits, and that but basically it once I started investigating the very real allegations of child abuse and abuse of minor boys in Hollywood in the late 90s of internet millionaire Mark Collins Rector, child actor young Gordon Bombay in Mighty Ducks 2, Brock Pierce, also First Kid, a Disney child actor, I should add, and basically that they were renting a vast mansion in Encino where they were throwing parties wherein they would lure anywhere from, I would say, 12 to 16-year-old boys, and then ply them with drugs like ecstasy and cocaine and lots of alcohol, and then coax them into hot tubs where then they would be molested by various high-ranking executives and big shots in Hollywood. And so diving into that angle of child abuse, I quickly came upon somebody who I'd never heard of before, and that was Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. And the reason his name pops up so readily is because he sort of merges three vectors. So you have somebody who was prominently abused, somebody who was prominently accused of participating in some kind of child abuse ring in the mid-1980s in San Francisco at Presidio Army Base when he was serving as a reserve PSYOP officer. And then you have, of course, leading from that, his very highly decorated military career starting in Vietnam in 1969, and his background as a psychological operations officer and also as an attaché to NATO. He was a Green Beret. As we'll talk later, he was involved in the Phoenix program, a program of counterinsurgency, assassination, torture, rape, and murder that was conducted by the CIA in Vietnam. And then on top of all of that, as if those two things were not bizarre enough, he is one of the most prominent Satanists in modern United States history. He basically joined Anton LaVey's, also a San Francisco native. He joined his Church of Satan in, there's a little disagreement of whether it was 1968 or 69. Mae Brussel says that he actually joined the church in Vietnam, which is very interesting. Mm-hmm. But basically then broke off from the Church of Satan in 1975 to found the Temple of Set after a disagreement with Anton LaVey And Michael Aquino became the second highest ranking member of the Church of Satan while he was in it. So he was essentially Anton LaVey's number 2 while he was still active and reserve duty in the U.S. military. And in 1975, after, I believe he claimed receiving a vision from the Egyptian god Set.
The way that he frames it, is that basically the way that it was the way he conceives that there's aeons, and I think he actually refers to the Crowleyan aeon of Horus as coming before that. Basically, it's kind of like a sequence of prophecy, in a way. There's the aeon of Horus, which Crowley sort of represented. Then there's the aeon of Set, which LaVey was the prophet of, the aeon of Satan, which LaVey was the prophet of. And then there's the aeon of Set. And that was initiated when Aquino received this revelation, the Book of Going Forth by Night, which is kind of a play on the Book of Going Forth by Day, the very important ancient Egyptian religious ritual document, or sort of format or type or category of ritual document, really. But yes, and basically, in broad terms, what this was kind of moving away from the sort of shock-oriented or sort of superficial attention-seeking aspect of Satanism, where it was kind of a anti-religious polemic, into something that was more based on actual esotericism and communing with certain figures, to the figure of Satan. The way that Set frames it himself in the Book of Going Forth by Night is that, Satan was useful for a time, but now Set will take, his true form. And Aquino has said in the past, it was difficult to get people on board with worshiping the devil because he's sort of fundamentally evil. Like, that is really the main connotation of the devil, by his very essence, he's evil. So getting people on board with that is difficult, whereas Set is a bit more of an ambiguous figure. Although Aquino's understanding of Set, as he laid it out, is not very good, especially now in the years since. But when Egyptology and our understanding of the way this deity was worshipped has become more sophisticated, his understanding of Set is very limited, but this ain't here nor there. So anyway, that was the genesis of his temple, in his own terms. How he framed it was this sort of revelation that happened to him from this god.
Yes, and also I listened to one of the last interviews he did on a sort of occultist conspiracy podcast, and another motivation for him breaking with Anton LaVey was that I believe it was around 1975 that Anton LaVey started charging money to you could basically buy a priesthood in the Church of Satan starting around 1975. And Michael Aquino, according to him, thought this was very hypocritical and not the behavior of a serious questing esoteric order. And he had really looked up to Anton LaVey. In some ways he was sort of a mentor to him, but he saw that he always saw Anton LaVey as a enemy of hypocrisy in all forms, and he thought selling ranks basically to anybody who wanted to join, because he said Anton LaVey was having some financial troubles, basically led to a deep sort of philosophical disagreement, and that was another reason why he broke off and formed his own temple. And so to get back to sort of our personal story, I discovered all of this in 2014, and it was also in quick succession after that was looking into the Jerry Sandusky child abuse ring at Penn State. I was looking into Jeffrey Epstein back in 2014, and I remember we had some kind of spirited debates, I guess, over it back at the time and granted, I was probably coming at it very hot. I still had a very kind of hazy understanding of... Well,
at the time, all this stuff was mixed in with some other stuff, There was some Sandy Hook stuff. there was, there was entertainment of a bunch of different things, and there were certain blind spots around maybe certain individuals, like maybe a certain Donald Trump was his complicity in some of the Epstein stuff was sort of looked away from. Where
this was even before Donald Trump ran for president, so it was. I'm talking. He kind of wasn't. I think it was his name popped up, but it kind of was just like, oh, whatever. It was. It seemed much more relevant at the time that he was so tight with Bill Clinton, and it did seem apparent back then that there was probably an 80% chance that Hillary Clinton would be the next president. And then you see people like Larry Summers and various Silicon Valley heads, and even people like Stephen Hawking going down to Epstein's Island, and all of these celebrities, and it really can, even to, I think, as millions more people have experienced since the Epstein thing blew up, it can really make your head spin, but especially back then when it was such a marginal thing, and you're right, it was mixed in with all kinds of stuff. Sometimes it was mixed in with UFO conspiracies. Sometimes it was, I would say often, mixed into kind of various sort of disinfo right-wing takes on conspiracies that people like Alex Jones were pushing. Though curiously, he never kind of dove too deep into any of this stuff. He always kind of kept it at arm's length. Though he'll say vaguely that they're all satanic pedophiles, but he won't talk about these actual cases that happened where elites were, abusing children, which is fascinating. But anyways, at the time, I think I showed you Michael Aquino, and I said, to the depth of my core, my God, man, like, look at this guy. Look at him. Look at his pointy eyebrows and his widow's peak. He's completely goofy looking with his Dr. Spock haircut and his all black and his satanic pendant and his army uniform with a chest full of medals, and his involvement in the Phoenix program, and this, and also going off, another thing we will do an episode about is the Franklin scandal in Omaha, which is actually my first exposure to the concept of elite pedophile rings in, say, the 1980s onward. And that deserves its own whole episode. But there was one of the victims who actually insisted on testifying in that case, who we mentioned in episode 1, Paul Benassi, not only claimed that he encountered Michael Aquino on multiple occasions, I believe, passing off suitcases full of money to Larry King to launder for the Iran-Contra enterprise, but also claims that Paul Benassi claims to have participated in the kidnapping of newspaper boy Johnny Gosch in Des Moines, Iowa in the early 80s. And for those who haven't encountered that story, he was one of the first milk carton kids that was very famous. And his mother came to believe that he was abducted as part of some kind of sinister network or conspiracy. There's a whole thing about there's a Netflix documentary called Where's Johnny? I can't remember if it mentions Aquino, but Paul Benassi said that I believe that him and the guy that kidnapped Johnny ended up taking him and passing him off to somebody known as the Colonel, I believe in Colorado. And I think he later identified that Colonel as Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who was actually he was usually stationed at the Presidio base in San Francisco, but he did have some assignments in St. Louis, Missouri, and in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio in the early 1980s. So he was kind of in and out of the Midwest. But based on everything I had read or seen from the Franklin scandal, which is immortalized in a banned Discovery Channel documentary from 1994 called Conspiracy of Silence, that was almost like a Rosetta Stone for me. Like I believe this story, and so I'm going to compare the subsequent stories I discover to this one. And the Presidio one seemed to sort of check all the boxes, and even had some of the same, at least one of the same personalities allegedly involved in it. And so I think when I came to you with Michael Aquino, I said, like, look at this guy. Like, he's got to be evil. And I think you were, correct me if I'm wrong, a little bit skeptical, right?
Well, I was skeptical of what sort of induced my skepticism was his website, Kefir.org, or Kefir, I think is how he pronounces it. It's actually like it's a real like ancient Egyptian word, which means become.
Do you want to spell it?
Yeah, it's XEPER.org is the official website of the Temple of Set. So I remember coming across this, and yeah, you can go to the website, but what struck me about this was that, I don't know, it just seemed kind of goofy. We'll go through some of the Presidio stuff. There's a lot of, like, some of it is, like, spooky. Some of it, like, this dude, yeah, by the very nature of, like, being, like, a prominent Satanist, like, in the military, that's, like, really part of the smokescreen of it, where if he was, like, complicit in any of these things, like, it's harder for them to stick because everything's tainted by the fact that he's, like, the most obvious sort of witch hunt target. But, you know, when this sort of sinister organization was pointed out to me, the Temple of Set, I looked into it and I realized that you can actually apply to this organization to become a member. You know, it sort of presents itself as being elite in some way, but it's one that you can sort of apply to. So I thought, well, you know, I think that I can... I don't really know if this even was what you were trying to kind of suggest at the time, or what. But I just felt that if this was some kind of like elite organization that was involved in all this sinister stuff, and like getting in would somehow give me some level of access to like these sort of secret societies or secret activities, then I felt strongly that I could get in and see what was going on, and I did get in.
So you infiltrated the ground floor of the Temple of Set,
and I successfully lied to them. So they weren't able to use my like dark magic of lying was stronger than theirs, I guess. Because I just made up a bunch of stuff like based on my general knowledge of the occult, my interests in like Crowley and things like that. I just like said a bunch of things. I made up like fake rituals that I performed that hadn't happened, you know, because there was this whole long interview process. It took a really long time. I had to write like this whole thing talking about like my Setian initiation. One of the funniest things that I said was that, you know, I played Set in a play when I was like in 5th grade or whatever, which is true when we did our like ancient Egypt unit. That's one of the only like true facts that I put in there. You know, I threw in some stuff I knew about Satan, talked about my interest in Satan, blah, blah. I got in touch with some guy, Maggie Stair, and I corresponded with him for a while, and he asked me some interview questions, you know, some of them about Crowley, things like that, asking me to describe, like, the 6 principles of magic or something like that, or, like, a step-by-step project of changing the world through will. It was very strange, yeah, and I remember him... we eventually did a phone interview, and he was very odd, he kind of, I remember his voice as being kind of like that voice, much like, you know, Aquino's voice, like, that's sort of unusual, yes. But, yeah, he, was like a weird, like, older dude, who I guess was sort of managing the temple's day-to-day affairs. I talked to him, and he was saying, you know, when you do this stuff, like, one day your life is just gonna go boom. You know, there was a young man who was dating a nice young lady, and he was and he had a nice job or whatever. He was experimenting with black magic, and one day, you know, it all fell apart or whatever. And then, but then he got a better job, and he, like, you know, some kind of stuff like that, like trying to like sell me on like the self-improvement that was going to come through like being a part of this organization. But yeah, I mean, I showed you some of the stuff, again, sort of violating like the rules of not sort of revealing any of what was inside to you know, people on the outside. But I showed you some of the stuff we saw on the inside, and you know, like their newsletter, things like that, some of the like the really cringy poems that they would be sort of sharing. It did really seem to me that there were teenagers in the Temple of Set, like that there were like 16-year-olds writing poems about, like, you know, in the darkness, like, I saw the figure of Set, like, you know, he walked across the room, like, I said, like, I accept darkness, Set smiled, or whatever, you know, like, just like... yeah, I saw some of the literature, and the forms were, like, so you know, they were just people talking about doing rituals to, like, summon, like, anime characters, like, things like that, so, like, you know... that's part of the reason why I think it's interesting to focus on Aquino himself. Like, he's an interesting figure. The temple, and like certainly like in terms of the rank and file membership, I wouldn't say that they're like plugged into any kind of thing. It's ironic that he. And part of the reason why I didn't stay in to just ride it out was, well, on one hand, you do have to do like a little bit of work to progress. You have to like correspond with a level 2. An adept, I believe, is the designation. And then you have to, get sort of recognized by an adept. Again, like all this sort of contradictions and this sort of self-focused, like self-initiation thing. You always, you have to be recognized by an adept. Like, of course, he's not giving you the rank. He's just recognizing that you've initiated yourself, this sort of, but anyway.
Oh, yeah, the self-initiation fetish.
Yeah. But of course you still have to, but anyway, so I didn't really want to go through the whole process of that. I did get a message from a guy who was like, hey, I'd like to meet with you sometime to discuss black magic. I don't remember if I ever wrote back to him, but anyway, yeah, my 2-year mutual evaluation period with them ran out, and I also didn't want to send them like money because they were trying to like charge, like that's the thing, like it's interesting that he was upset about people buying priests. You can't buy a priest in the Temple of Set, but you certainly have to pay dues to maintain like their server, where Aquino hosts like all of his documents and his mom's poetry and stuff like that, so.
We'll talk about his mom. We will.
Yeah.
Actually, no. So you never went to any Setian gatherings, and you never met Michael Aquino, correct?
No, I thought about it. I mean, Maggie Stair, who I spoke with, he was like, well, maybe you'll get to meet Aquino during the if you come to a conclave. And I was like, maybe will get to meet him. Like, I feel like I should get to meet, but I didn't attend. I still have my Temple of Set membership card and my white pentagram that they issued me.
I have
which
seen
is like
that, yes.
Yeah.
And I think actually that might have been the time frame when he was undergoing treatment for colon cancer, so he might have been sick at that time. And we should also mention, maybe one of the only reasons we're talking about this so openly is because it's Ipsissimus Dr. Lieutenant Colonel Aquino transcended his mortal body either late last year or earlier this year, aka he is dead now.
Yes, but, we should not be afraid of retribution just because he's dead, because he has been known to attack people astrally.
Allegedly.
Yes.
According to conspiracy theorist Max Spears, yes, he was battling Aquino on the astral plane or something along those lines.
Yes.
That sounds a little bit... Actually, Aquino himself, even in the MindWarrior paper, I'll read some excerpts later, is quite dismissive of sort of parapsychology things like remote viewing and ESP, and I'll explain why, and he almost drops a big hint as to maybe what was really going on with all that stuff.
He does believe in Kirlian photographs and stuff like that, and acupuncture. He definitely believes in some like that stuff. He definitely did think that he would remanifest, and but anyway, So
should I kind of start at a chronology of sort of who is Michael Aquino and what sort of things was he really up to in this world when he occupied it?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. So Michael Aquino was born in 1946 in San Francisco, California. He was the son of Michelangelo Aquino Sr., who was an Italian immigrant and former Army sergeant who served in World War II under Patton's Army, and then I believe subsequently became an investment broker. And his mother was a very interesting personality, Betty Ford Aquino, who came from an old money, high society San Francisco family. Think Getty's, Crocker, Stanford, some of the same milieu of the people we talked about in the Kamala episode, but basically some of the oldest sort of haute bourgeoisie in San Francisco. Betty Ford's father, Dr. Campbell Ford, was a notable surgeon, and I have been able to find the address listing for Dr. Campbell and his wife Sophie Ford, whose lineage I've not been able to trace online yet, but he claimed on a Usenet thread years ago that she was also from a very old money, high society San Francisco family, and his grandmother taught piano lessons to the Crocker children, and the Crockers were one of the 4 big railroad families, along with Stanford, and I'm forgetting the other 2 right now, that basically parlayed their immense profits into starting a bank, the Crocker Bank, which was absorbed by Wells Fargo in the 80s. And so, by the way, Michael Aquino almost never mentions any of this stuff when he does interviews, that he comes from a very wealthy, high society San Francisco family. He often describes his childhood as sort of a typical Eisenhower, kind of every American. Sometimes in some of these interviews, he doesn't even cop to growing up in San Francisco, even though I've been able to prove, based on the Blue Book listing of his grandfather, that Michael Aquino is living in the house that his grandfather, the prominent surgeon, purchased roughly 100 years ago, which is in Russian Hill, sort of near Pier 39. Very, very nice, pricey neighborhood, and it's a big-ass house. So he, and that's the house he...
Usenet postings of him sort of bragging about how rich his grandma and his mom were, and how his grandma would take him out shopping, and she would just be like, put it on credit or whatever, and not use any kind of and how she went to Germany and met Hitler at
that is a very bizarre story. So I think we'll get to that in a second, but maybe I should talk about maybe this is a good time to talk about his mother, Betty Ford Aquino. No relation to Betty Ford, the former First Lady, and she's in fact much stranger than the First Lady. So Betty Ford Aquino was born in San Francisco and basically was recognized at some point as a child prodigy. And this is around the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And her parents sent her down to, where else? Stanford University, to a child psychologist by the name of Louis Terman, who was conducting a sort of longitudinal gifted children study at Stanford to try to identify the traits and characteristics, and I actually don't know what else. I haven't looked into the nuts and bolts of the sort of experiments he was doing on children, but it bears mentioning that Louis Terman was a pretty passionate eugenicist.
Yeah, extremely passionate.
Extremely passionate eugenicist.
Enthusiastic eugenicist, yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, a lot of people don't know this, but California had a eugenics program in the early 20th century that sterilized, I want to say, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people who were considered mentally defective. Of course, a disproportionate share of these people were racial and ethnic minorities. Not a big surprise there.
That was Louis a big part of Terman's views as well, that certain races of people had inferior intellectual abilities.
Yes, and it shouldn't surprise any of you, dear listeners, to know that the inventor of the modern Stanford Binet IQ test, which often has been polemicized and used by racialist and white supremacist thinkers, was invented by none other than Dr. Louis Terman. Who borrowed it from the Binet test in France, brought over and added some different things to it, but was very confident that you could scientifically reduce a human being's intelligence down to a single number, which I think a lot of people disagree with today for very good reasons. But basically, Louis Terman he took on Betty Ford as a teenager and studied her for many years. And given the long-term nature of his study, I would assume kept in touch with her throughout the rest of his life. And he actually wrote the foreword for a book of poetry that Betty Ford wrote, I think in her late teens, but was never published until Michael Aquino found it in his attic decades later, and then self-published himself. But it has it has some news clippings in this book, and also an introduction from Dr. Lewis Terman, who really speaks glowingly about Betty Ford and how intelligent she is, and how he hired sort of other English professors to compare her poetry to the teenage poetry of people like Wordsworth and Yeats and other poets like that, and how she basically, she was up in the class with like the best of them, basically. It's interesting that she didn't go on because she eventually went to Stanford and graduated in 3 years, and I think went there when she was like 16 or 17. So she was quite young, and in one of the news clippings of the time that Aquino put in his book, it's mentioned that she only had 3 years of proper schooling before entering Stanford, which I found, for a rich kid in San Francisco at the turn of the century, even granted she was a female, but don't you think that's a little weird?
Yeah,
I mean, she's weird. A genius, and she wasn't even in school.
Yeah, well, I'm sure she was getting some kind of education. I'm sure there were people who were mentoring her.
Yeah, I guess she might have had private tutors. It really kind of brings into question sort of what kind of household she was growing up in with this prominent doctor, Dr. Campbell Ford, and I think
after she got out of Stanford, she went abroad, right? She went to Germany in the early 1930s to study sculpture.
Yes.
With George Kolbe, I want to say. Kolbe?
George Kolbe, yeah.
Yeah.
Who was a prominent German sculptor. Whose work was very highly appreciated by the Nazis.
Yeah, he did a lot of contracts for, the Nazis, and for others, but yeah, definitely for them. She studied with him, and then before returning to the United States, so I guess she got in other kinds of art, and then she was in public radio.
Oh, yes. We cannot fail to mention that, as Aquino has bragged about several times, that Betty Ford went on to become one of the founding members of the Pacifica Foundation and KPFA Radio in Berkeley and KPFK Radio in Los Angeles, which were the first, I'm going to put heavy air quotes around this, fully listener-supported radio stations in America. Of course, they got their first foundation grants in 1951 from the Ford Foundation, and then over the years, like the Pew Charitable Trust and the Carnegie Endowment and every other sketchy sort of capitalist tycoon NGO foundation that you could imagine. And that was founded by another Stanford graduate, Lewis Hill, who was, just so happens, I'm sure this has nothing to do with his political thinking, was the nephew of Frank Phillips, a big-time oil magnate who founded the Phillips Oil Company, which is now today known as ConocoPhillips, which is still all over the place. And he was a devout pacifist going in the 1930s, and then when World War II began, unlike most kind of politically involved people who dropped the pacifism, he filed as a conscientious objector and served out the war in like a civilian conservation corps job. And then after World War II in the late 40s, founded KPFA Radio and the Pacifica Foundation. So it's just not to ascribe anything super sinister to his pacifism, but I think when you find anybody that was super passionate about staying out of World War II after the invasion of the Soviet Union and after Pearl Harbor, that coalition dwindled down to a small cluster of certain types of political tendencies, the biggest among which were fascists and Nazi sympathizers. So just kind of interesting. Now, before I think we kind of go on, I want to circle back because it'll be interesting when we talk about the Presidio scandal about Aquino's maternal grandfather, Dr. Campbell Ford. And I found this buried in the November 1st, 1894 issue of the San Francisco Examiner. And, you know, when we're asking, like, what kind of childhood did Betty Ford have and what kind of upbringing did she have in this rich family with Dr. Campbell Ford, I just want to read you a little bit from this article. Wanted to leave the baby. Dr. Campbell Ford tried to dispose of a newborn infant on Rincon Hill and is arrested. His story of the age of the infant contradicted by the surgeon at the receiving hospital. The strange maneuvers of a coup attracted a crowd on Rincon Hill about 10 o'clock last evening and finally led to a discovery of a peculiar set of facts and the arrest of a physician. The coupe contained a good-looking, full-bearded man, which held in his arms a tiny bundle from which, at intervals, came a plaintive cry that could be distinctly heard by the curious crowd. Someone took the trouble to notify policeman Meriton, who took the coupe to police headquarters and turned its occupant over to Captain Douglas. The man proved to be Dr. Campbell Ford, whose office is at 734 and a half Broadway, and he carried in his arms a girl baby, which he said was but 2 hours old. In response to the questions of Captain Douglas, the physician said he had been called to a house in the southwest corner of Pacific and Stockton Streets about 7 o'clock in the evening to attend a young Italian girl who was about to be confined. The baby which he held in his arms was born an hour after his arrival, and at the request of the mother, whom he took to be an unmarried woman, he had undertaken the disposal of the child. He called a coupe and was driven to Sister Julia's sheltering arms on Harrison Street, but she refused to take the infant. From there he was driven to several places on Rincon Hill, trying to find someone who would take the child, but was taken in charge by the policeman before he had accomplished his object. The child's father. The doctor displayed great agitation during the recital of the story, but insisted that he had no intention of doing anything criminal. He said a man who keeps a restaurant on the corner of Clay and Stockton Streets was present when the child was born, and paid him $17 for his professional services. This man, he supposed, was the father of the infant. He declared that he did not know the names of any of the parties concerned. The hackman corroborated the statement in some particulars, but said he first went to the doctor's office. He drove the physician to the corner of Pacific and Stockton Streets, where someone brought the infant and handed it to the coupe. He then drove to Sister Julia's and around Rincon Hill as directed. Placed under arrest. Captain Douglas thought the story decidedly suspicious and placed Dr. Ford under arrest. He was taken to the city prison where he was charged with attempting to abandon a minor child. The infant was placed in the care of the matron of the receiving hospital. It is a large, healthy-looking child with black hair and a decidedly Italian cast of countenance. Assistant Police Surgeon Barry said the infant was at least 15 hours old, but it was more probable that it had first seen the light 24 hours before it was taken to the hospital. About 7:30 in the evening, someone called up the receiving hospital by telephone and asked if that was the place to take deserted babies. The answer given was that the hospital was not a foundling asylum. Captain Douglas has ordered a full investigation of the case. So, Michael Aquino's grandfather got arrested for stealing a baby in 1894.
Yeah, I wish that we could find out, like, whatever became of that, or what happened with the child, I assume that he was let off.
Yes.
But I wonder, yeah, I mean, it's very hard to say, like, what actually occurred in that situation.
It's just, it's very weird that Michael Aquino would be accused of something so chillingly similar 90 years later, and it's just a weird thing.
Yeah, it's like a Lovecraftian, like, generational Satanist type story, unfolding or sort of knocking down the door there.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, that did make us think a little bit about, is there something a little bit more intergenerational? You hear that thrown around all the time, and usually I've never seen a ton of hard evidence to, like, substantiate a lot of the people that accuse of being intergenerational Satanists, but this is a little bit interesting in that, that he was he was caught running around with a baby that wasn't his, and then he has a daughter and sends her to this child genius study kind of experimental program down at Stanford where a prominent eugenicist studies her for years, and then she goes to study sculpture with George Kolbe in 1930s Germany during the absolute peak of Nazism. I remember reading there were some rumors that she had an affair with an SS officer. I think there were even rumors that Michael Aquino's father was actually an SS officer, and that Michael
That's
Aquino
one of the few
Sr.
times you'll get him to mention his father.
Mostly
like when he's sort of dismissing the rumors that he is actually the son of an SS officer. Although I feel like if he were, he would be proud.
Well,
it's funny,
of course he would. As we'll see later.
No, I'm not. But if I were, he would 100% be bragging about it. I mean, he went to an SS castle and did a ritual in the Black Sun Room with a Nazi dagger. It's not like he's ashamed of being associated with Nazis.
He absolutely is not, and it almost, you see him struggling to basically contain his enthusiasm when he talks about Heinrich Himmler or the Ahnenerbe and the SS, when he.
Yeah, he loves Nazis.
Very fascinating. And we'll also mention, just to circle around, I don't know, like you said, we don't know the results of that investigation. Presumably he was let off. But I found one other old news clipping about Dr. Campbell Ford, and this is his obituary, which for some reason was published in the Salt Lake Tribune on the 12th of February, 1934. And this is a short one. I'll read it quick, and you can draw your own conclusion. Retired coast doctor found dead in bathroom. San Francisco, February 11th. Dr. Campbell Ford, 70, retired physician, was found dead with his throat slashed in the bathroom of his home here today, and police said he had apparently killed himself with his razor. They said there was a possibility the fatal wound may have been accidentally inflicted while Dr. Ford was shaving. The physician, before his retirement some years ago, developed the suture, which in surgery is known as the Ford stitch. So, he potentially committed suicide in the house that Michael Aquino ended up living in his entire life by slitting his throat with a razor.
That's a very interesting obituary because, almost the irony of it, the fact that it mentions that he came up with this unique type of stitch and he was killed by, a severed vein or, a sliced artery, there's, an irony to it. It's almost seems like some kind of thing that would happen in, a horror movie or a demonic possession horror movie type of thing, like the dramatic irony or the satanic irony of it. But it's it's weird that the police said that there was a possibility that it was accidentally inflicted, because what's the alternative? That he did it on purpose, he committed suicide, by slitting his own throat?
Well, they did say, they said it, apparently he killed himself, but then they left the door open to saying, well, maybe it was an accident, but very weird.
I remember that Henry David Thoreau's brother, I think, died that way. Or, people, I think that it was, more common than you would think to, kill yourself through straight razor shaving. But, I don't know. And, I guess if you're an old man, you got shaky hands, but even still, it's a very gruesome way to die, and there's certainly, a very trenchant irony in it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting. I don't know exactly if he's pinned down the exact date that his that his mother, Betty Ford, went to go study in Germany. I don't know if it was maybe several years before Campbell Ford slashed his own throat, or if maybe she went to Germany right after he did, maybe to distract herself from that very traumatic event. But there is a story that we found on an old Usenet thread, I believe, or maybe it was a Google Groups thread from 2001 or 2002, where Michael Aquino was answering questions about his background, and he recounts a story when his mother was studying in Germany. His grandmother, Sophie Ford, came to visit, and actually, no, she must have been here earlier, because the person they run into wasn't in power yet. But they were eating at a restaurant, and there was a large table full of boisterous men in snappy uniforms, kind of laughing and causing a ruckus. And this is a very high society Berlin restaurant. And I guess Sophie Ford, being a lady of high manners, was absolutely disgusted by their behavior and marched over to them and basically told them to cut it out and get a hold of themselves. And the man who is sort of the leader of the table kind of assuaged her and said, "Oh, I'm very sorry, ma'am. We'll be better." And that man was Adolf Hitler. So, and Aquino told us this is like a funny story, and I guess presumably his grandmother.
The emoji that were like, the early internet emoji that he used. It was like, that very
smiley face.
It was like a smiley face with a little hyphen as a nose type of thing. Like, it was very, it was like, he said something like, "Oh, but Grandmama thought politics vulgar, so she didn't recognize him." Like, smiley face. It was very like, oof.
Yeah, and even just, I think that indicates something about her class, her class consciousness, that she found democracy vulgar.
Politics.
She found politics vulgar, but
he seemed to be proud of the fact that she was so opulently wealthy, and that was even part of the story. I think part of the same thread what he was talking about her. That she, would just go out to the shops and just buy all sorts of things extravagantly and just have them billed to her and, like, not even provide any, credit card or documentation, obviously, like, or checks. Just say, like, "Oh, put it on my credit." Like, it's this grand dame,
He did call her a grand dame of, like, old San Francisco, and the fact that she taught piano to the Crocker children, who were, one of the wealthiest families in the city. And also, I think Aquino, in that same thread, mentioned being dragged to the Crocker Bank many times as a small child because that's where his grandmother banked at. So I think some of that endless money supply is somehow tied into the Crockers, and then of course all these connections back to Stanford of that his mother has, and then we're going to see with like the military-industrial complex like coming about later. And I mean, when you think about it, like Stanford was formed by one of the other four big railroad tycoons of California, Leland Stanford, and this guy was no flower child. Let's say he was like a ruthless robber baron, and then if you look at like the people that started Stanford University, you not only had Louis Terman, who was a prominent eugenicist, but the first, I believe, the founding president and chancellor of Stanford University was a man named David Starr Jordan, and he was a huge backer. He and Terman were both huge backers of something called the Human Betterment Foundation, which was a eugenics organization established in Pasadena, California in 1928 by E.S. Gosney. And basically, according to Wikipedia, it primarily served to compile and distribute information about compulsory sterilization legislation in the United States for the purpose of eugenics. And so that, and if you read, their pamphlets, they're incredibly racist and incredibly spooky. And I was going to mention earlier that the Nazis became aware of the California eugenics program in the 1920s and 30s and actually studied it and built their eugenics program in a way it was sort of modeled off of the California experience. And of course, the Nazis sterilized, I think, somewhere around 400,000 people, even before World War II, or euthanized them outright. But basically, like much like how Manifest Destiny was sort of an inspiration to Hitler for his Lebensraum policy. And even like, white supremacy, the idea of the Übermensch and the Untermenschen, he sort of looked at the America, and particularly the American West, as a kind of laboratory to, build this new order that he wanted to build. So you can see that the Michael Aquino's family, they're very close to the action, much more than he has kind of ever let on. That, he has some of this information comes from him directly, but he always kind of downplays the. You'd think somebody that is as kind of smart and reads as much as he does and is kind of a quirky intellectual character would sort of bring these things up even as trivia, as for example, I'm putting a pin now, so y'all got to stay tuned. But it's a little funny to think that Louis Terman, his son, Frederick Terman, who became an engineering professor at Stanford University, is generally regarded as one of the two founding fathers of Silicon Valley. And like I said, we're going to put a pin on that for now. We'll come back to it. But that is very few degrees of separation from some of the most important players in the whole Stanford Bay Area military industrial intelligence eugenics complex.
Yes.
So we can, now that we've done a little bit on Aquino's family, let's get back to his biography. For some reason, he went to high school in Santa Barbara. The family might have had a second home down there, but then he ended up getting a scholarship to UC Santa Barbara and joined the ROTC program there. And then upon graduating, I believe it was in 1967, he immediately went into officer training, and I specifically requested to be deployed to Vietnam and see combat action. So he received Special Forces training and then PSYOP training, and was assigned to a PSYOP battalion and ended up going to Vietnam in 1969. And according to his telling the events, while going back to San Francisco in 1968, he stumbled upon Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan and started sort of hanging around this group and was very interested in their sort of spiritual outlook and everything they were doing. And then
I remember reading in Aquino's biography of LaVey that he later wrote, and I guess you were telling me before we started recording that he would send, because that was after their falling out, and he would send drafts of it to LaVey and his wife, and they just wouldn't answer him. But in that biography of LaVey, he talks about, he recounts meeting him for the first time. As he tells it, it was at the premiere of Rosemary's Baby. And
yes, actually, you're right. It was in San Francisco, correct?
I don't remember if it was, though it makes sense if it was, but yeah, LaVey had been a consultant on that movie, which I really think we should do, at some point we should do an episode about some of these movies, because there's all sorts of interesting things going on. But anyway.
Yes.
And that's another.
And Anton LaVey was an advisor to Roman Polanski.
Yeah.
And later on, one of the people who I found pictures of was involved with the Church of Satan and participated in some of their rituals in San Francisco in 1968, went on to be one of the people that would stab Sharon Tate to death in the Cielo house in 1969 as part of the Manson murders. But again, we'll get back to that later.
Polanski's film oeuvre is very interesting because there's also the lesser-known movie The Ninth Gate with Johnny Depp, which has all sorts of very spooky resonances looking back at it in hindsight. But anyway, that's neither here. The point is that Aquino kind of retells this whole story of being this kind of starstruck, wide-eyed kid seeing LaVey for the first time with this kind of rock star energy, and hearing about how he was a consultant on the film and kind of wanting to follow him and be a part of this. So that's how he tells it, this very sort of, moment of being kind of stricken by this figure sort of coming out of his black limo or something like that. I really think is kind of, that's the image that I have in my mind. I think that's kind of what he conveyed in the story.
Yes, and it's kind of interesting that that Anton LaVey also, I believe, grew up in San Francisco and also inherited a very fancy, spooky house from his parents. And I get, presumably, they never had any awareness or contact with one another until that premiere of Rosemary's Baby. But who can really say? But anyways, I guess that sparks an interest in 1966. And he either joins, according to Mae Brussel, Michael Aquino officially joined the Church of Satan while he was in Vietnam on a combat tour in 1969, which would be kind of interesting because I could understand in San Francisco, you just go down to the Church of Satan and join them. That's easy. But who were the pre-existing Church of Satan members in Vietnam that, did he write them a letter and send them like a membership check? Like, how exactly did that work where he decided while he was in country in Vietnam to become a Satanist, basically, an official Satanist?
I mean, this dude took it more seriously. He was more into this probably than Anton LaVey himself.
Yeah.
So he was really, really into it. He's probably the person, as you said, in American history, like, he may not just be the most prominent Satanist or one of the most prominent Satanists, but he's like probably, I think you can confidently say, the person who was most in to Satanism, very devoted to the idea, or this sort of dark esotericism, eventually kind of evolved into Satanism, which isn't really, Satanism is fundamentally satanic by his own description, but anyway, his conception of Satanism. But so it's very spooky when you think about what Aquino was up to in Vietnam, like what he was thinking about. It's interesting because, the Church of Satan is all about, these very spectacular kind of subversions of Christian ritual, the crazy stuff like the Zena LaVey's famous satanic baptism, like all these sort of provocative acts. And, what he was really into was the psychological operation. So
he was from the very beginning. He was obsessed with psychological operations and PSYOP. So I'm gonna cite a few quotes from his, what he calls his automobiography called Ghost Rides, which was published self-published several years ago.
The automo thing is because it's all about how he loves cars, like automobile, automobiography. Yeah, like
yes, and for an ostensibly middle-class posturing Eisenhower kid, he definitely had a very exotic taste in like muscly sports cars and Ferraris and Lamborghinis and Shelby Cobras and stuff that don't seem to conform with what would have been his modest salary as a military officer. So he probably had some family money kicking around to blow on big beefy cars. But anyways, so this is from chapter 2, and he begins by saying, Richard Nixon sent me on an all-expenses-paid vacation in Indochina from June 69 to June 1970. For about half that time, parentheses, we won't discuss the other half, I was assigned as an HA Command and Control team leader of the 6th Psychological Operations Battalion, proponency for 3 Corps Tactical Zone, the quarter of South Vietnam including Saigon, of the 4th PSYOP Group, proponency for the entire country. As HA1, I supervised several HE, Civic Information, and HB, combat propaganda teams working with the American and South Vietnamese units throughout 3CTZ, as well as elements of MACV-SOG, MACV-SOG, regional and popular forces, civil operations, and rural development support. CORDS, he says, the agency, capital A, the CIA, since it was not supposed to be there under its own name. American and South Vietnamese Special Forces, and anything where else the 6th, 4th, 2nd Field Force G5, or the great old ones that Joint United Public Affairs Office of the Department of State in Saigon might dream up. Basically that's a very jargon-laden description of the units he was involved in. But we want to talk about, so he mentioned there that the other half of his deployment, the second half of his deployment, he is just basically not going to discuss. And he's been haunted by rumors and questions for years as to the level of his involvement in the Phoenix program, which, as I mentioned, was a vast counterinsurgency, assassination, torture, snitch, rape, murder program. Really perfect for a Satanist, if you think about it, that was meant to target the Viet Cong support networks and their supposed sympathizers all over mostly South Vietnam, but also into Laos and Cambodia. And so I did listen to a podcast interview that he did several years ago where somebody directly confronts him on whether or not he participated in Phoenix. And he gives a very I am actually not at liberty to discuss these classified matters, so I'll have to defer your question. But he said something along the lines of basically, yeah, but I'm not going to talk about it. And so we can assume that at least for 6 months he was involved in this program, which really oversaw some of the most sinister, brutal war crimes of the entire Southeast Asian, the whole Indo-China wars of the 60s and 70s, and also experimented in a lot of things. It experimented with mind control, with torture techniques, with networked counterinsurgency technology. They put little sensors out in the jungle that would trip and then notify a computer in Saigon, and then you could go bomb it. It didn't work very well, but it was kind of the first attempt to sort of build a kind of internet-backed weapon system, like an early warning system for guerrilla attacks. And they were just really, it was run by the CIA. For a time, it was run by William Colby, who later became CIA director in the 70s. By all accounts, Michael Aquino was involved in this. And we don't know exactly what he did, but we know about one specific operation that he conceived or co-conceived because he brags about it from time to time. Operation Wandering Soul. And would you like to describe a little bit about what Operation Wandering Soul is, Khalid?
Yes, it's extremely spooky. The operation is spooky, and it's based on sort of a Vietnamese folk belief, which really is pretty common. It's the idea, basically, that if someone dies, it's basically, what things people still think now today about ghosts. If someone dies in a horrific way, isn't buried properly, doesn't have the normal ritual process around their death, and or dies violently or in a in a gruesome way, that basically they'll be doomed to wander the earth in pain, in some kind of torment. Basically a relatively transcultural ghost idea, insofar as anything is transcultural. But so this it's interesting because I wonder how effective something like this would be in a different context. So there's definitely some sort of idea that this would be more effective, on these, sort of primitive Eastern peoples, maybe. But and it, may be true that some of these beliefs have greater currency than maybe they did in the United States at the time. But in any case, it's basically the idea of ghosts, and the PSYOP is this recording. It's also known as Ghost Tape Number 10. And it was sort of played on, people's backpack loudspeakers or out of helicopters. And it's basically,
basically, the way Aquino described it in one of his interviews a few years ago is that they would attach these incredibly powerful loudspeakers to a helicopter, and then they would fly over jungle positions where they thought the VC were hiding during either monsoons or thunderstorms, and then they would fly up high enough so that the sound of the rotor blades wouldn't be noticed, and then they would aim the speakers downward, and they would play this tape they had developed, which was ostensibly a dead Viet Cong comrade being tortured by demons in the afterlife, and imploring his comrades to give up their fight and go home to their family. So we're going to play a little bit of Ghost Tape number 10 right now, and you can get a little taste of Michael Aquino's early PSYOP work. So here we go. Okay, so as you can see, that's an incredibly creepy tape to play.
Yes. Let's just go through some of what this is actually saying.
Sure.
This dude is first there's sort of the voice of a little girl kind of saying "Daddy, Daddy, come home with me, come home, Daddy, Daddy," and there's sort of this ghost father, who can see his family but he's invisible, and he says, "Who is that? Who is calling me? My daughter? My wife? Your father is back home with you. My daughter. Your husband is back home with you. My wife. My body is gone. I am dead, my family. Tragic. How tragic. My friends, I come back to let you know that I am dead. I am dead. I am in hell. Just hell. It was a senseless death. How senseless. How senseless. When I realized the truth, it was too late. Too late. Friends, while you are still alive, there is still a chance you can be reunited with your loved ones. Do you hear what I say? Go home. Go home, friends. Hurry. If not, you will end up like me. Go home, my friends, before it is too late. Go home. Go home, friends. Basically, according to the soldiers who actually be playing this stuff, the response was, the idea, as you can kind of see from the text, is that, or the dialogue, is that, the idea is that they would go home, that they would give up, but the response that they actually got is that people would shoot at them.
Assuming that they were able to hear the helicopter it was being played from or identify the source of it, they generally would just attack it.
Yeah, and you can just imagine Aquino feeling such delight at this idea, the notion of this sort of spooky stuff that he was so into, somehow manipulating this, dealing with ghosts, and it will be played around twilight time, trying to
or during scary thunderstorms. Yeah, so there'd be lightning and thunder, and then this guy, you can hear the echo. Apparently, according to Aquino, this was recorded, or the recording was developed in a top secret kind of joint operations radio laboratory in Saigon that was jointly run by the CIA and the State Department, and they had all kinds of really high quality audio equipment there. So that's where they developed it. I think it's kind of an open question whether this was properly connected to the Phoenix program, but the fact that, I don't know, it seems like maybe of all the Phoenix things or Phoenix adjacent things that he could have participated in, this is maybe the one that he can kind of joke about and talk about because it doesn't involve necessarily any horrific war crimes. I think he makes a point in his interview to say that this was one of the earliest examples of what would come to be what would be later developed into his theory of mind war. And he says with no small amount of pride that he was able to actually get a certain number of VC irregulars to surrender their weapons and defect. Though if you just go to the Wikipedia page, granted this part at the end doesn't have a citation attached to it, but I kind of wouldn't doubt it. It said that people who actually did buy into it and came out of hiding would just get shot down or bombed by the Americans.
But yeah, if you actually follow some of the earlier citations from that article, you can come to this website. Sort of, again, the website itself is not really cited, but it's a little bit more thorough. And it has some testimonies from soldiers. It says a Sea Wolf helicopter pilot who flew a number of PSYOP missions in 1968 to 69 recalled playing what he called the Howling Ghost tape many times. He said that on about half of the missions, a PSYOP officer would fly with us and attempt to direct the mission. We dropped leaflets, magazines, and played the tape. Without exception, we drew fire each mission. This is one of the primary objectives of the mission. When not flying the PSYOP missions, the pilot, Sea Wolf 57, flew mostly in support of the Navy SEALs. The Wandering Soul tape did not just appear full-blown in the Vietnam scene. There were earlier variations. One former operations officer of the 10th PSYOP Battalion told me, I do not remember that Wandering Soul reverb tape at all. I know that the time of that tape follows my tour by 1 year. Our tapes were of Vietnamese funeral music and most of the standard fare sent by the group. He recorded Robert Brown's Fire from 1968 and used the demonic portion repeatedly in an endless loop. He mentioned that the tapes often enraged the Viet Cong and led directly to their death.
Interesting. So in a way, I mean, it sounds like the
yeah, the whole idea of getting to the fact actually it made them furious and it made them reveal their positions. Maybe was the way that was practically being used. Yeah.
So I see so many parallels here, and by the way, I think maybe it's a testament to the Marxist-Leninist pedagogy of the North Vietnamese that they were able to sort of inoculate the VC peasants against superstitions that would allow them to be manipulated. I mean, it's a very kind of racist assumption.
It reminds me a lot of the Project Bluebeam stuff that you would sometimes hear about, like, you know, this idea that you're going to send, like, a voice into someone's head and be like, this is the voice of Allah, like, stop fighting, you know?
Yes, yes. There were a lot of rumors that that type of technology was deployed in both Gulf War I and the Second Iraq War. I think where, I don't know if it was ever substantiated, but there was this rumor came up both times that they had some kind of audio weapon that could beam the voice of Allah into the soldiers' heads and, at bare minimum, scare the shit out of them in advance of, you know, an overwhelming, like, American air assault. But definitely would be. It's interesting that those ideas reemerged later when, like, Michael Aquino was on the ground in Vietnam doing this very early manifestation of mind war.
Yeah, or even, you know, you even see it today in sort of the idea of people being kind of like targeted individuals, like the idea that the government's putting voices into their heads, things like this. It's, it's interesting because, the obvious response, even if you could beam something like this directly into someone's head, like, would they, you know, is someone so naive to assume that, especially if they're in, like, an active military situation, are they so naive to assume, like, oh, you know, I'm hearing, and if it's this canned kind of audio, you know, it's just so... Yeah. Like, it's there's a certain condescension that's inherent in it, you know. Like, I feel like people aren't worried about countering this type of weaponry being used, like, on Americans or something like that. You know, civilized Western people. It's just like this idea that we can manipulate their, like, naive superstitions and, like, make them think that Allah is talking to them or something like that, or that
Absolutely.
A ghost is calling, you know. But obviously, like, it does have an effect. Like, it is still like it certainly has a psychological impact, but it's a thing. It's funny with these sort of PSYOP operations where you can say, oh, it's successful because it had some sort of psychological reaction, like a lot of things do.
In a sense, people, I mean,
you know,
if you think about it, it seems almost a more realistic reaction that it might infuriate some of the regular soldiers who, I don't know, maybe saw it as like an insult to their sort of traditions, and it would, which actually syncs up a little bit with his sort of whole provocative persona and challenging Christianity and, like, kind of triggering evangelicals in the 80s, which I think, if you look at his appearances on Oprah and Geraldo, he is kind of eating it up. Like, he loves being on there and scaring the shit out of all these Christians.
He
really does.
And it would make perfect sense, you know, it dovetails very well with... I actually kind of think that I do think kind of at that point, like, he was starting to be, like, a little bit worried. I felt like the pressure was on him a little bit at that point when he was, like, on that stage and there. Yeah, but I felt he was sweating a little bit in that situation. But certainly at this time, like, this was the height of, like, his very early enthusiasm about Satanism and, like, the idea and, like, the ideas that would just, you know, come into full flower, like, in his later thought. You know, so this is right up his alley. Something that's right up his alley.
And the last thing I would bring up about Operation Wandering Souls is that I kind of saw it as a potentially instructive example of how domestic psyops inside of the United States, and specifically coming out of California in the late 60s and 70s, would sort of come to function basically by using cutting edge, or you could say occulted technology that the public was generally not aware of. And this could include radio waves, radar, LSD, techniques of group encounter therapy like EST, and certain cult techniques, and even elements of Maoist pedagogy and group organization that, like, MIT and Stanford were studying. studying, in addition to electronic surveillance and networked intelligence databases, both private and public, like ARPANET being a huge example, that would basically mimic supernatural forces and prey upon existing superstitions and cultural sentiments to psychologically manipulate targets in a much deeper way. And I think, like, when you get to the 70s and the 80s, like when Stanford is doing all this research into parapsychology and ESP and remote viewing, that research is connected to both the CIA and the military, that I can't say I'm 100% settled on sort of this hypothesis, but I'm definitely leaning towards the idea that a lot of this remote viewing stuff that Stanford was doing was contemporaneous with the development of things like GPS and satellite imagery and the internet and all of these other things. And if you think about the world we live in today, those are the technologies that came out of Stanford that completely transformed our world. And in a way, they, just like I think we talked about on the first episode, in a way they almost do function like magic. I think if you told somebody in the 60s about everything our phones and GPS and satellites can do today, it would sound almost sound quote unquote magical. So, but then, you know, putting the smoke screen of like woo-woo over it, and whether it's Aquino's kind of black magic or it's more new agey hippie kind of a ESP or all manner of things like that, you could, because one thing a lot of people don't know is that the Soviet Union was also intensely interested in, well, both military communications technology and certain aspects of parapsychology, and they were doing their own experiments with like telepathy and ESP and remote viewing, and I have to imagine that at least some of that was because they knew that people in California were doing it. And in fact, there were exchanges during the détente era between the Esalen Institute and certain Soviet scientists who shared notes, basically. So the question, I think, is I can't quite answer it fully right now, but I think we'll talk about it, you know, down the road, is like, to what extent was even the whole research of like you know, ESP, remote viewing, and telekinesis, and all these things, to what extent was that a psyop to sort of misdirect or confuse the Soviets while we were building what would become the internet?
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I am more inclined to say that they're things that belong to kind of the same category or the same sort of geostrategic purpose, or it kind of reminds me of, you know, if you think about it from the point of view of occult organizations, I'm reminded of like something that Aquino's wife, Lilith, said on her discussion of her order within the Temple of Set, the Order of the Vampire with a Y, where she, you know, kind of talking about how, you know, real vampires don't drink blood, you know, real vampires don't do this stuff, you know, like this is not part of the sort of vampire craze that was happening, like whatever, when she wrote this, like in the 80s or 90s. It like you know, it's something that's like we're the real vampires, like in the same way that the Temple of Set is like we're the real Satanists. I see it as kind of similar, where there's like sort of infighting amongst these guys, where you know, maybe the internet is a more effective form of the same practice of remote viewing that other people would try to get at in different ways. So maybe that could be deployed in some respects as a smokescreen, but I don't know, I feel like it's part of the same like cluster of experimentation. I think actually like the first paragraph from the original MindWarrior white paper that Aquino wrote, like in the 80s, is like a good sort of way to conceptualize that, because he starts off talking about this article that some dude wrote.
It's actually not. It's not just some dude. It's Lieutenant Colonel John Alexander, who was one of the principal officers involved in Operation Stargate and other associated programs. Basically, if you've ever seen the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is a total limited hangout, by the way, I believe that John Alexander and General Albert Stubblebine were kind of the two main military officers who became very fascinated with like ESP and paranormal and parapsychology and potentially weaponizing it.
Yeah, so I guess that dude wrote an article for the Military Review called The New Mental Battlefield, Beam Me Up, Spock. And Aquino said, his article in support of psychotronics, intelligence and operational employment of ESP, was decidedly provocative. Criticism of research in this area, based as it is on existing frontiers of scientific law, brings to mind the laughter that greeted the Italian scientist Spallanzani in 1794 when he suggested that bats navigate in the dark by means of what we now call sonar. If they see with their ears, and do they hear with their eyes, went the joke, but I suspect that the U.S. Navy is glad someone took the idea seriously enough to pursue it.
I think...
Yeah.
And if I can read, I highlighted the second paragraph in this because I feel like it's a big fat kind of clue, at least to what maybe Aquino's perspective was, but also to my theory that basically some of this was maybe a cover for... I'll just read it. Here we go. So he goes on to say, psychotronic research is in its infancy, but the U.S. Army already possesses operational weapon systems designed to do what Lieutenant Colonel Alexander would like ESP to do, except that this weapon system uses existing communications media. It seeks to map the minds of neutral and enemy individuals and then change them in accordance with U.S. national interests. It does this on a wide scale, embracing military units, regions, nations, and blocks. In its present form, it is called psychological operations, or PSYOP. So, I mean, he's kind of speaking broadly about PSYOP there, but I thought in terms of specifically about satellite technology, the proto-internet, and things of that nature, and any kind of maybe classified psychotronic weapons that they have that use radio waves and frequencies to inflict their effects, rather than any kind of ESP. He's saying basically, the Army already possesses operational weapon systems designed to do what these guys want ESP to do, except that it uses existing infrastructure and like real material technology that we already have or are in the process of building. So I think that's a little, he's like showing maybe his cards a little bit there. But let's dive deeper into Mind War, because we've already covered how he founded the Temple of Set in 75. He had a number of positions in the military, kind of bounced in and out of reserve status in the 70s and went back to grad school, gobbled up a couple graduate degrees and maybe, I think even his PhD, which was about the neutron bomb in the late 70s. But then in 1980, he writes this white paper called From PSYOP to Mind War, The Psychology of Victory, and it's co-written with then, I believe, Colonel Paul Vallely, who actually went on to become a very constant presence post 9/11 as a Fox News contributor, and and he eventually became a general and then retired and became a sort of regular presence cheerleading for the Iraq War in the early 2000s, and perhaps was executing his own form of mind war on the American public, and I guess because he didn't have the cloud of the Presidio abuse scandal, that he was able to go to the highest ranks of the military, and I think he was either a brigadier or a major general. But anyways, they co-wrote this white paper. It's not very long, but I would say the one of his major points about it is that they lost the Vietnam War, not because, as he says, because we are outfought, but because we were out-psyoped. Our national will to victory was attacked more effectively than we attacked that of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, and perception of this fact encouraged the enemy to hang on until the United States finally broke and ran for home. So our PSYOP failed. It failed not because its principles were unsound, but rather because it was outmatched by the PSYOP of the enemy. The Army's efforts enjoyed some impressive successes, but our own PSYOP did not really change the minds of the enemy populace. Think of Operation Wandering Minds, nor did it defend the U.S. populace at home against the propaganda of the enemy. Presumably he's referring to the anti-war movement. And he says the lesson is not to ignore our own PSYOP capability, but rather to change it and strengthen it so that it can do precisely that kind of thing to our enemy in the next war. Better hardware is nice, but by itself it would change nothing if we do not win the war for the mind. So, Yeah, so it sounds like he's saying it's ironic that like the hearts and minds strategy was a sort of a meme during the Vietnam War within the U.S. military, but I think what he's saying in this critique is that it basically it was operating in kind of an outmoded theoretical framework of like what PSYOP should be used for, and was just sort of dropping pamphlets and occasionally doing a spooky ghost thing, but not really, waging a full-scale mind war against the Vietnamese population to sort of, psychologically win them over to our side.
Yes. There's definitely some, in the Mind War paper, there's definitely some, paranormal flirtations, talking about using atmospheric electromagnetic activity, air ionization, and extremely low-frequency waves to make people more receptive to ideas and things like that.
He does say that at the very end, and he cites a few examples of atmospheric electromagnetic EM activity, which he says, he mentions that sunspot eruptions and gravitational stresses, which distort the Earth's magnetic field, can make humans more or less disposed to the consideration of new ideas, and mind war should be timed accordingly.
Yes, but that's fucking interesting, because that's like a really classic occult idea. Basically saying using astrological
astrology,
which is part of any type of ritual, is the timing. So of course
he's claiming almost basically a material scientific basis for kind of the same type of strategic thinking of like Hitler consulting his astrologist before deciding when to invade a country.
Yeah, basically, he's saying that it's the same thing as saying this is how to be a real vampire. He's saying this is the way to really read minds. This is the way to it's very much you can definitely see the influence of these ideas that he subscribes to in this paper, for sure. And I mean, he would later characterize the PSYOP, as we talked about on this show in the past. The PSYOP is basically like a lower black magic working, and it's definitely conceived in that way. I mean, what is Operation Wandering Soul if not a summoning? If you're listening to the audio, it's very similar to this kind of EVP type phenomenon, the way that it's put together. It's one could maybe even compare it to a Kenneth Anger type of recording, or some of Zeno LaVey's sort of experimental sound work with Radio Werewolf or whatever, werewolf,
Radio Werewolf. And Kenneth Anger is also plugged into all these people, of course. And it's interesting to think of his sort of experimental movies also in a way as kind of a ritual, audiovisual kind of initiatory kind of work of quote unquote art. In a way, I think that the way he's being cute on some level is, I think that there might be something to what you're saying, but on some level I think that the way he's being cute is almost in reverse, where he's sort of using this jargon and his intellect to kind of obfuscate like what he really is deeply into. He's kind of in a way defending this idea of, I'm sure that like at the time people were like ESP, things like, but he's in a way saying like this the thing about the sonar, people laugh off this idea, but and I think that this is the principle really that we even apply in this podcast, not laughing off some of these ideas that might sound outlandish, but I think that this is kind of, he's sort of saying like, well, but let me tell you, like using my greater way of explaining it, my greater way of contextualizing it, that, it's similar to a lot of I think you're right in that. I mean, I think kind of the like the meta text or the macro of what he's saying is still very rooted in occult thinking and the kind of deeper spiritual kind of warfare ideas that he had developed as a Satanist and as a Setian, but then kind of the micro is, and here's how we can utilize actually existing technologies to affect this kind of to sort of operationalize these magical concepts in the real world and achieve real results.
Yeah, and I think that he's basically trying to teach the U.S. military to use magic, basically, and I think that that's sort of how he conceives himself. I was wondering, like, in Ghost Rides, I kind of didn't really look into this part, but does he even talk about, like, what drew him to want to join the military in the first place?
Part of it, he doesn't. He talks about it a little bit in Ghost Rides. He also talks about it in the interview that I listened to from a couple years ago. And I think one part of it, and I think he's being a little coy and not telling the whole story. But I think one of the things was that he was an Eagle Scout. He was like a really enthusiastic Boy Scout, and then became, I think he was something like the national leader of like the Eagle Scout Honor Society or something like that. I'm looking at like his CV here.
I don't know if there probably is maybe a little bit of obfuscation involved there, but in a way it does make sense because scouting is like all about initiation. It's all about progress. It's all about like the same. It has that same structure, and the degrees and things like that. It makes sense in a way. Maybe he makes that parallel himself between like occult initiation and advancement, and it makes it dovetails back with the whole like grievance with Anton LaVey selling, the ranks in the Church of Satan.
He was. And it might have something to do with his father being a World War II veteran. Might have encouraged him to join the military, though it seems a little incongruous given his fascination with the Nazis that he would be inspired by his father's service in Patton's army, fighting the Germans. He seemed to have a lot more sympathy for the German side, or at least it doesn't have many bad things to say about them. I don't know.
You're a nerd and you like to collect medals. I mean, the pentagram thing that I got, it's like a medallion. It's a medal. Like, it's like it's the same thing. Like the idea of collecting these medals, and as you go up in grades, you get a pentagram of a different color. The idea of like collecting these little things, collecting these SS daggers. I don't know.
Yeah,
it makes sense. Yeah.
And there's also the question of like in his interview they asked him about his religious upbringing, and he claims that he was not particularly brought up in any religious tradition. I guess his father obviously was an Italian Catholic but wasn't particularly devout, and his mother was also not raised up in any specific religion, which I find an interesting blank spot given, her rich family and Louis Terman and her father stealing babies and all that kind of stuff. And the fact that Betty Ford Aquino joined the Temple of Set.
Really?
Like, she was in the Temple of Set. Yeah. So, but he kind of makes it sound like they asked, like, what did your parents say when you decided to become a Satanist? He says, oh, well, they looked upon it as slightly unusual, and they had parental concerns that this may affect my military career, but they supported my choice, and just kind of brushes it off like they were like, oh, whatever, Mikey, do what you want. But like then the mother joined him, so she was clearly like kind of down with it. I don't think the father ever did.
I wonder if it was something that he like prevailed, because I mean people often like try to get their parents to join their religion like out of some sort of desire to save them or something like that, trying to get your mom like, come on, like say La ilaha illallah like on her deathbed or whatever, like I don't know.
All I know is he also mentioned, which was interesting, that his parents were married. They looked around for a church to get married in, but most of the churches were distasteful to his mother, so they ended up getting married in a Swedenborgian church, which I guess was some kind of minor Swedish Christian offshoot.
The Swedenborgianism is extremely sus, actually, and it has a connection to Freemasonry and this sort of like esoteric Christianity that was like that kind of sparked earlier on in sort of the I guess he was mostly active during like the 18th century, like the mid to late 18th century. Yeah. But yeah, he kind of had revelations and stuff. It's peculiar. It's a peculiar choice because it's a very like eccentric form of Christianity. He had very eclectic views, and it was definitely like something that helped to ignite kind of the occult exploration of the 19th century that we sort of talked about in episode 2.
Interesting. I'd actually never heard that much about them. I have no idea of what their footprint in San Francisco was. Now, of course, San Francisco and California in general were hotbeds of spiritualism and theosophy and various forms of occult or new Christian movement kind of teachings going back to, like you said, like the 19th century. But yeah, it was just an interesting point of note that she... Yeah, like most churches were kind of repugnant to her, and they got married in the Swedenborgian church, and then she eventually joined the Temple of Set. I think she died in 1985, so she, somewhere between 75 and 85, she joined his temple. So that's kind of...
A fun fact about Emanuel Swedenborg, before we move on from him, was that he drew like a flying machine. Which, people have pointed to as, I think you can maybe guess what this flying machine resembles.
A flying saucer, perhaps?
Yes, a little bit of a sort of ovular, yes, it's a very, very UFO-esque image. Yes.
Interesting.
The operator would sit in the middle and paddle himself through the air. Yeah, you can find a picture of it online. But yeah,
that is interesting because Aquino has played coy over the years, especially in his later interviews on various obscure podcasts, where he often alludes to it in Ghost Rides and a number of like weird fictionalized kind of stories about being taken to Hangar 17 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where they kept the UFOs, like the crashed spacecrafts. And he's mentioned, he does have a space intelligence certification. He, I think, worked for Space Command for a while and was a sort of advisor to the highest levels of like U.S. military space research in both the 80s and the 90s. So, but he's very kind of, you don't know if he's really just fucking with you or not. I would imagine maybe to some extent.
We definitely should on this podcast. I'm going to mention it now, but we would be remiss if we didn't mention his book "We Break the Sword," which is one of the most like outrageous things that he's ever put his name to. Which is basically a fanfic about the Nazis using mind war to peacefully win World War II. Basically, the Nazis just decide like, instead of doing all the stuff that we actually did, like, what if we use mind war? And relatedly to that, it's a plot element of the book is that they have this device that actually is sort of a rumored thing. It's unclear like how real it was, but it is one of the sort of rumored Nazi wonder weapons, Die Glocke.
Die Glocke, yes.
Yeah, which is kind of similar type of sort of UFO device that obviously Aquino had some fascination with, this stuff like the Nazi Antarctica myths and all the things about their sort of occult experiments, both real and mythologized. He obviously had a serious fascination with it, hence his desire to go off to the SS Castle and sort of initiate his new knighthood of Satanism or whatever. So
we'll get to that in a moment. And before, I'll just drop a little more on Mind War before we move on to his activities at Wewelsburg in 1984. But what I wanted to say is that he also applies Mind War. He essentially implies that the U.S. media should be used to be sort of the tip of the spear of mind war. So I'll read this little passage here. To this end, mind war must be strategic in emphasis, with tactical applications playing a reinforcing supplementary role. In its strategic context, mind war must reach out to friends, enemies, and neutrals alike across the globe, neither through primitive battlefield leaflets and loudspeakers of PSYOP, nor through the weak, imprecise, and narrow effort of psychotronics, but through the media possessed by the United States, which have the capabilities to reach virtually all people on the face of the earth. These media are, of course, the electronic media, television and radio. State-of-the-art developments in satellite communication, video recording techniques, and laser and optical transmission of broadcasts make possible a penetration of the minds of the world such as would have been inconceivable just a few years ago. Like the sword Excalibur, LOL, we have but to reach out and seize this tool, and it can transform the world for us if we have the courage and integrity to enhance civilization with it. If we do not accept Excalibur, then we relinquish our ability to inspire foreign cultures with our morality. If they then desire moralities unsatisfactory to us, we have no choice but to fight them on a more brutish level. Okay, that's terrifying.
He's just such a D&D nerd. Like the whole thing about like Excalibur, it just but yeah.
But then mixed with basically some like hardcore Nazi
very careful mixture that is just so unique to Aquino. He's like just so absolutely goofy, but also so like incredibly sinister. Yeah. It's just I mean, he's the gift that keeps on giving.
There's a little more here that I just want to read to sort of drive this point home. And it's specifically dealing with how he's basically saying that mind war needs to target domestic American audiences and the audiences of our allies and our adversaries. It needs to basically be a global PSYOP campaign. So he says mind war must target all participants if it is to be effective. It must not only weaken the enemy, it must strengthen the United States. It strengthens the United States by denying enemy propaganda access to our people and by explaining and emphasizing to our people the rationale for our national interest in a specific war. Under existing United States law, PSYOP units may not target American citizens. That prohibition is based on the presumption that, quote, propaganda is necessarily a lie, or at least a misleading half-truth, and that the government has no right to lie to the people. The propaganda ministry of Goebbels must not be a part of the American way of life. Quite right. And so it must be axiomatic of mind war that it always speaks the truth. Its power lies in its ability to focus recipients' attention on the truth of the future as well as that of the present. Mind war thus involves the stated promise of the truth that the United States has resolved to make real if it is not already so. So he's saying, like, even if it's not the truth, like, we are going to make it the truth, and therefore it's okay because it's true.
Yes, which is what, and that's what magic is all about. That's transformation of reality.
Through will. The last thing, just the one sentence, because we didn't mention it earlier, like the one sentence definition that he gives of mind war is the deliberate, aggressive convincing of all participants in a war that we will win that war. So it's like a 360-degree total PSYOP campaign against everybody involved that manages kind of through, like you said, magical means to PSYOP everybody into believing that that our victory is inevitable.
Yeah.
And
it's that's secret, basically.
Power of positive thinking.
Yeah.
So clearly this white paper, though he claims was kind of just a minor curiosity and wasn't that big a deal, it clearly must have impressed somebody, because in 1981, when Ronald Reagan becomes president, Michael Aquino gets assigned to go overseas to Europe to become an advisor to the Supreme Command of NATO. And, of course, we probably will do an entire episode on NATO and basically how it absorbed huge numbers of Nazi generals and officers and SS war criminals into its hierarchy after World War II, and that these people played very big roles in in the management of the North Atlantic alliance throughout the Cold War. And so Michael Aquino, who at this point I think has, we could definitely say, a pretty major fascination with the Nazis, goes over there. And then would you like to describe what he does there in 1984 at a certain castle?
Yes, he went into basically a castle that was built for the SS. Again,
it's a medieval castle, but it was taken over by Heinrich Himmler.
Oh,
right?
Okay. I really did think that they had designed it specifically. Well, they certainly remodeled it because there is a Black Sun room. That was the one where he did his Wewelsburg working. And yes, so basically using an SS, really it became an initiatory thing for the Temple of Set, where he received a new word. I forget I think the word was Runa. It was something like that. It was something where he experienced some new word for initiating. I think it was the Order of the Trapezoid that
I think so.
He had this sort of experience of. But anyway, he went there. He waved this SS dagger around. I think that I'm not sure if you what you see. I don't think that this actually was recorded. No. The Wewelsburg working.
Well, not
but you
publicly.
Can definitely see video of him. It's not difficult to find video of him waving the dagger around in the castle and everything like that. And he basically thought that always he would always say that the ideology, he would always be verbally or superficially opposed to the ideology of Nazism that we're familiar with, but he obviously believed that there were occult principles in sort of certain Nazi beliefs that were true and of serious value, and that we could really constructively learn from. And yes, so this is part of the reason why.
I think
even though they were wrong in some other ways, at least he would tell you, out loud. They really had a lot of stuff figured out in terms of magic, and that's why it was good to go to this castle and do this.
Yeah, and he said, I was listening to some of Mae Brussels' excellent 1987 episodes that she did about Michael Aquino, and according to her, I wasn't able to find the source for this, but she quoted him as saying that the purpose of the Wewelsburg working was to, quote, recreate an order of knighthood for the followers of Satan. It's not about communism or anti-communism, it's that Satan is going to win, and we are part of this operation.
Yes.
Cool.
And, yes. This became a big part of the Order of the Trapezoid, which was something that really had traveled through the history of the Church of Satan. It had existed within the Church of Satan and then kind of been reordered. You can actually read, if you go to trapezoid.org, you could read a whole thing about the history of the Order of the Trapezoid, its evolution. And he talks about the Wewelsburg working. The emblem that is used today for the Order of the Trapezoid, which is a very Germanic runic thing with this kind of hammer, was conceived in the Wewelsburg Castle, Westphalia, Germany, during the Wewelsburg working on October 19th. And he gives the date in the Setian calendar as well as CE. So he says it was 17, the year 17/1982 in the Hall of the Dead. It was sketched on a desk in the Wewelsburg caretaker's office when I returned to the Valhalla keys to him following the working, and was drafting in precise mathematical proportions on the table in Eva Braun's tea room in the Eagle's Nest at Obersalzberg. I could have done the drafting before then, but wanted the environment to be magically appropriate. There were few tourists milling around in the main room of the Eagle's Nest, but as it turned out, I had the wood-paneled tea room to myself.
Wow, so cool, Michael.
Yeah,
really rad.
Anyway,
yeah.
Well,
we don't know exactly what he was doing in his capacity as NATO attaché in the early '80s, besides doing SS dagger rituals and
we
Heinrich
don't know
Himmler's
actually
castle.
What the substance. It seems like almost he was running around while there were tourists there, doing this magical stuff, and then running into Eva Braun's tea room to draw out this bizarre glyph.
I would say that it's possible that he
the
had
actual text of the ritual, or the
I would say, given his predilections, that he probably made some very high up friends in the West German government who allowed him to have, free reign in these places.
Yes, I
will also mention about this, and again, I haven't been able to substantiate the sources for it yet, but on Mae Brussels' old broadcast, she mentioned that there was evidence that multiple members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were members of the Temple of Set, and some of them were present at the Wewelsburg working. So he was, far from being, just the member of the leader of this obscure little cult. He had some very powerful people. I think one of the big names that could potentially be kind of linked to him is Alexander Haig, who became the Secretary of State. I think he was the former Supreme Commander of NATO and has like a very spooky right-wing kind of career over the years. And I forget how much their paths crossed, but he was a bigwig in the early Reagan administration and in the Nixon administration, and is a pretty grotesque figure. And then there were also, I guess, connections somewhere down the line to, well, since we're talking about NATO, about the Freemasonic P2 Propaganda Due Freemasonic Lodge in Italy that was basically a neo-fascist secret society run by Licio Gelli, who was a Mussolini supporter during World War II, who said in later years, I was born a fascist and I will die a fascist. He did die a few years ago. And was responsible for all kinds of terrorist attacks during the years of lead in the 1970s and early 80s, including the Bologna train bombing, some of which were blamed on the communist Red Brigades, but were actually done by fascists connected to the security services. And also Michael Ledeen, who I guess was connected to P2, involved in NATO, and I think wrote a book with General Michael Flynn more recently. Like, he's a weird name that pops up all over the place, both in the 80s, Iran-Contra, and even before that with, P2 and NATO, and then in the Bush administration after 9/11, and then even with, some of these later generals, and I think has kind of become, an anti-Muslim sort of conspiracy theorist. Yeah, he's a very interesting figure. We can touch upon him later. But basically, I mean, Aquino, all of this is to say that his career was going very, very well up through the early 80s, and I believe he went to, it was the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. So he was almost, you could see him almost being groomed to be a general maybe by the 90s. And so he comes back from Europe in 84, and I believe he sort of split between working at the Presidio U.S. Army base in San Francisco and in St. Louis at, I forget the name of it, but basically kind of moving back and forth. And that is when something happens that kind of flips everything on its head and unleashes the floodgates of chaos into this mastermind warrior's life, and that would be the Presidio daycare child abuse scandal.
You may be an ambassador to England or France. You may like to gamble. You might like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're gonna have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Maybe a rock and roll addict prancing on the stage, money, drugs at your command, women in a cage. You may be a businessman or some high degree thief. They may call you doctor, or they may call You're gonna have to serve somebody. Yes, you are. You're gonna have to serve somebody.
Serve somebody.
Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody.
Serve somebody.
It may be a state trooper, it might be a young Turk, maybe the head of some bigger TV network. You may be rich or poor, you may be blind or lame, maybe living in another country under another name, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Yes, you are. You're gonna have to serve somebody.
Serve somebody.
Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody.